Snow fell thick and white across the quiet village lane in the Yorkshire Dales, blanketing everything in a hush. Archie Lewis, a single dad pulling an extra late shift at the local co-op, heard a small voice trembling just outside the closing shop. "Mister, please. My mum never came home." All night long, the little girl wore only a thin anorak, her cheeks flushed red from the cold, her eyes wide with panic. She said she'd been trudging through the blizzard to find someone, anyone who could help. Archie swallowed hard. "Take me to your house," he said, and stepped into the storm. The car park lights flickered against the swirling snow as Archie knelt down, wrapping his own scarf around the child's trembling shoulders. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with dark hair plastered to her forehead from melted snow, and tiny hands that shook when she tried to wipe her face. Archie Lewis had seen fear before in his 7 years with the mountain rescue team in the eyes of folk who thought they wouldn't make it through the night. But something about this little girl's terror cut deeper. Maybe because she reminded him of his own son, Leo, waiting at home with the electric fire on and a promise that Dad would be back soon with the shopping. Archie was 36, weathered in the way blokes who work with their hands tend to be, with calloused fingers and a quiet manner that made people trust him without quite knowing why. His dark hair was streaked with early grey, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd lost more than he ever talked about. Since leaving the rescue service 3 years ago, after watching a mate die on a fell side he couldn't reach in time, Archie had been piecing together whatever work he could find. Warehouse shifts, delivery runs, late-night stocking shelves at the 24-hour supermarket, anything to keep the lights on and Leo fed. Being a single father meant no room for pride, only survival. The girl introduced herself as Audrey Bennett, 6 years old, polite even through her panic, with a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she understood more of the world's cruelty than any child should. She lived with her mother in a rented cottage at the end of Woodland Lane, where the tarmac turned to gravel and the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sky. Her dad had left when she was 2. Her mum, Alexandra, worked the night shift at a small pub in the town centre, pulling pints and trying to save enough for a better life. Audrey was used to being alone in the evenings, but never overnight. "Never like this." "She always comes home," Audrey whispered, her breath coming out in small clouds. "She rings me before bed every single night, but the phone doesn't work anymore. The power went out. I waited and waited, but she never came." The fear in her voice was the kind that came from a child who'd been brave for too long, who'd sat in the dark convincing herself everything would be okay until she finally couldn't anymore. The entire village was buried under an unusual blizzard. The kind the Met Office labeled dangerous and told people to stay indoors. Roads were impassable. Power lines down across half the county. Archie had just finished his shift, his coat dusted with snow from unloading the last lorry, ready to head home and heat up some soup for Leo. He hadn't expected his life to veer in a completely different direction because of one sentence from a stranger's child. But here he was, looking into Audrey's desperate eyes, and all he could think about was his own son and what he'd want someone to do if it were Leo standing alone in a blizzard asking for help. "Okay," Archie said softly, checking his mobile. No signal. The storm was wreaking havoc on the masts. "We're going to find your mum. But first, I need you to stay close to me. Understand? Don't let go of my hand." Audrey nodded, gripping his fingers so tightly her knuckles went white. Archie pulled out his keys and thought briefly about driving, but the roads were too dangerous, and Woodland Lane was on the other side of the village, past the motorway slip road that was probably already closed. They would have to walk. He sent a quick text to his neighbor before the signal died completely, asking her to check on Leo, then turned to Audrey. "Lead the way." The wind hit them the moment they left the car park shelter. Snow came sideways, stinging Archie's face and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Audrey walked beside him, her small legs struggling through drifts that came up to her knees. Archie lifted her onto his back when they reached the first fallen tree blocking the pavement. Her cold hands clutching his collar as he climbed over splintered branches. The world was white and howling, every sound muffled except for the wind's relentless roar. It felt like walking through the end of the world. Woodland Lane was even worse. The houses grew sparse here, separated by long stretches of woods where the snow piled high and untouched. Audrey pointed to a faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the storm. "There," she said. "That's home." Archie pushed forward, his legs burning from the effort, his breath coming hard. When they finally reached the small cottage at the end of the lane, he saw immediately that something was wrong. The front door hung slightly open, snow drifting onto the threshold. No lights, no warmth, just darkness and the eerie creak of wood swaying in the wind. Inside, the house was freezing. Archie pulled out his mobile and used the torch to scan the room. Overturned chairs, broken dishes scattered across the kitchen floor. A small table knocked onto its side. Signs of a struggle. Audrey's breath hitched when she saw it, her fingers digging into Archie's arm. "Mummy," she called out, her voice small and trembling. No answer, just the wind whistling through cracks in the walls. Archie moved carefully through the rooms, checking cupboards and corners, his instincts from rescue work kicking in. In the kitchen, he found a mobile phone beneath the table. Screen cracked and dead. Alexandra's phone, he guessed. Near the back door, he noticed something else: footprints in the snow, adult-sized, heavy treads, and drag marks as if someone had been pulled unwillingly across the frozen ground. The tracks led away from the house toward the woods before disappearing into the darkness. "Audrey," Archie said gently, kneeling beside her, "has anything strange happened lately? Anyone your mum seemed worried about?" The little girl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded. "There was a black car," she whispered. "It parked down the street sometimes. Mummy would look out the window and lock the door really fast." Her hands shook. Archie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't just a woman who got lost in the storm. This was something deliberate, something dangerous. He searched the house more thoroughly, opening drawers and checking counters, looking for anything that might explain what happened. In Audrey's bedroom, painted with faded stars on the ceiling, he found a small notebook tucked under the mattress. Audrey watched him with wide eyes. "Mummy said, if something ever happened, I should give that to someone I trust," she said quietly. "Someone who would keep secrets." Archie opened the notebook carefully. Inside were work schedules, notes about pub stock, and several names with question marks beside them. Men who caused trouble, men who made Alexandra nervous. At the bottom of one page, circled 3 times in red ink, was a name: Bernie Crow. The wind hammered against the windows, and Archie realized they couldn't stay here. The house was too cold, too exposed. And if someone had taken Alexandra, they might come back for Audrey. He couldn't risk it. "We're going to my flat," he told her, helping her into a warmer coat he found in the wardrobe. "You'll be safe there, and then we're going to find your mum." Audrey looked up at him with eyes that held far too much hope for a child who'd just seen her home destroyed. "Promise?" she asked. Archie hesitated, knowing better than to make promises he might not be able to keep. But sometimes a promise was all a scared child had to hold on to. "Promise," he said. The walk back through the blizzard felt twice as long. Archie's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. He thought about his own past, about the mate who'd died because Archie hadn't reached him in time, about his ex-wife who'd left a note on the kitchen table 3 years ago and never looked back. He thought about all the moments when he'd felt powerless, when the world moved in ways he couldn't control. But this time, he told himself, this time would be different. He wouldn't stand by and let another person suffer if there was anything he could do to stop it. By the time they reached his small flat on the edge of the village, Archie's clothes were soaked through and his fingers numb. He unlocked the door and ushered Audrey inside, where Leo was waiting by the electric fire, wrapped in a blanket and munching biscuits. The 7-year-old looked up, surprised to see a strange girl with his father. "Dad?" he asked. Archie quickly explained what had happened while he helped Audrey out of her wet coat and wrapped her in a dry towel. Leo, without being asked, went to his room and came back with his warmest jumper. "Here," he said, handing it to Audrey. "This one's really soft." Audrey took it with trembling hands. And for the first time since Archie had met her, she almost smiled. While the kids sat by the fire sharing biscuits and hot chocolate Archie made from the last packet in the cupboard, he stepped into the kitchen and stared at his mobile. Still no signal. He tried the landline, But the storm had knocked out service across the entire grid. Calling the police would have to wait until morning. And even then, with roads closed and resources stretched thin, who knew when they could respond? Archie felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. If he wanted to find Alexandra Bennett, he would have to do it himself. He thought about the name in the notebook, Bernie Crow. Archie had heard that name before, years ago, in connection with loan sharking and pub brawls. A man with a record who somehow always slipped through legal cracks. If Bernie was involved, this wasn't just a missing person case. This was something criminal, something urgent. Archie looked back at Audrey, who was leaning against Leo's shoulder, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She had walked through a blizzard because she believed someone good would help her. She had trusted a stranger because she had no one else. Archie couldn't let her down. Later that night, after both kids had fallen asleep curled up on the sofa, Archie sat at his small kitchen table with the notebook open in front of him. He studied the names, the schedules, the notes scribbled in Alexandra's careful handwriting. The pub where she worked was called The Lantern, a dive on the industrial estate. Archie knew the area, had delivered parcels there before. Rough neighborhood, the kind where people minded their own business and didn't ask questions. If Bernie Crow was operating out of that pub, it would make sense, quiet, out of the way, easy to hide things. Archie's mind drifted to his own past, to the years he spent pulling people out of dangerous situations. He had been good at it once, before everything went wrong, before Marcus fell and Archie couldn't reach him in time, before the nightmares and the guilt convinced him to quit the only job he'd ever been good at. Part of him had been running ever since, taking work that didn't matter, keeping his head down, trying not to care too much about anything because caring meant risking loss. But looking at Audrey asleep on his sofa, he realized he couldn't run anymore. Some things mattered too much to ignore. When dawn broke pale and cold through the storm clouds, Archie made a decision. He asked his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, to watch the kids, explaining only that he had an emergency to handle. She agreed without asking questions. Bless her. Archie dressed in layers, grabbed the notebook, and headed out into the aftermath of the blizzard. The snow had stopped falling, but the world was buried under 2 feet of white, and the temperature had dropped so low his breath froze in the air. He walked toward the industrial estate, his boots crunching through ice. His mind focused on one goal: find Alexandra Bennett before it was too late. The lantern looked even seedier in daylight, its neon sign dark and its windows boarded up against the storm. But when Archie pushed open the door, he found someone inside. A barman sweeping broken glass from the floor. The man looked up, suspicious. "We're closed," he said. Archie held up a hand in peace. "I'm looking for information about Alexandra Bennett. She works here, right?" The barman's expression shifted, a flicker of something like concern crossing his face. "Haven't seen her since night before last. She left with some bloke. Looked like trouble." Archie's pulse quickened. "What bloke?" The barman hesitated, glancing toward the back room as if checking whether anyone was listening. "Look, mate, I don't want problems. But if you're asking, she got into it with Bernie Crow. He's been hanging around here, using the place for side business. Alexandra saw something she shouldn't have. Books that didn't add up. Cash that appeared and disappeared. She asked too many questions." Archie felt his jaw tighten. Where would he take her? The barman shook his head. "I don't know, but Bernie's got an old warehouse off the A9. Used to be a timber yard. If he wanted to keep someone quiet, that's where I'd look." Archie left the lantern with adrenaline coursing through his veins. The A9 was 15 miles outside the village, past the industrial parks and into the rural stretch where buildings sat abandoned and forgotten. The roads were barely passable, but Archie found a grit lorry driver willing to take him partway for £50 he couldn't afford to spend. As they drove through the white wasteland, Archie's mind replayed everything he knew. Bernie Crow was using the lantern to launder money. Alexandra witnessed it. She was smart enough to keep notes, smart enough to prepare for something going wrong. And now she was missing, dragged away in the middle of a blizzard because she'd seen too much. But there was something else, something Archie couldn't shake. When he'd looked through Alexandra's cottage, he'd seen a photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of Alexandra and Audrey, smiling. Taken maybe a year ago, and in the background, barely visible, was a newspaper clipping pinned to the wall. Archie had only caught a glimpse, but the headline had stuck with him: "Local rescue team saves Hillwalker." He couldn't remember why it seemed important, but it nagged at him, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. The warehouse appeared through the snow like a skeleton, its corrugated metal walls rusted and sagging. The grit lorry driver dropped Archie off a quarter-mile away and sped off without a word. Archie approached on foot, moving carefully, staying low. He circled the building, checking for entrances, for signs of life. At the back, he found what he was looking for: fresh tire tracks in the snow. A black saloon recently arrived. And inside the warehouse, muffled through the walls, he heard it, a voice, weak, calling for help. Archie's training kicked in. He assessed the situation quickly, methodically. One entrance at the front, barred. Side door rusted shut, but there was a loading bay with a broken latch. And through the gap, he could see dim light flickering inside, candles maybe, or a camping lantern. He pried the door open slowly, inch by inch, until he could slip through. Inside, the warehouse was cavernous and freezing, filled with rotting timber and rusted machinery. And in the center, tied to a support beam with heavy rope, was a woman. Alexandra Bennett looked nothing like the smiling figure in the photograph. Her face was bruised, her hair matted, her lips cracked from dehydration. But when she saw Archie, her eyes widened with recognition and something else, something that looked almost like disbelief. "You," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Archie moved toward her, pulling a knife from his pocket to cut the ropes. "I'm getting you out of here," he said. But Alexandra shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. I know you. You're the one who saved me 7 years ago. The hiking accident. The rescue team." Archie froze, the knife halfway through the rope. "What?" Alexandra's words came out in a rush, desperate and broken. "I was 25. Stupid. Went hiking alone in bad weather. Fell into a ravine. I thought I was going to die. But your team found me. You carried me out. I tried to thank you, sent letters to the rescue station, but they said you'd left." She looked at him with tears streaming down her bruised face. "I told Audrey about you, about the man with the kind voice who promised everything would be okay. When she heard you tonight, she knew. She knew you were the one I trusted." The revelation hit Archie like a physical blow. He remembered that rescue, a young woman, terrified and hurt, who'd clung to his hand the entire way down the fell. He remembered telling her she was safe now, that she was going to be okay. That had been one of his last rescues before Marcus died, before everything fell apart. And now, 7 years later, fate had brought him back to save her again. It felt impossible. It felt like the universe offering him a second chance he didn't deserve. Before he could process it fully, a sound shattered the moment. The warehouse door slammed open. Bernie Crow stood silhouetted in the doorway, a large man with a cruel face and a knife in his hand. "Should have known someone would come looking," he snarled. "Thought the storm would give me more time." Archie stepped in front of Alexandra instinctively, his body a shield. "Let her go," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "This doesn't have to get worse." Bernie laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Too late for that." What happened next moved fast. Bernie lunged forward, knife raised. Archie dodged, using the terrain to his advantage, knocking over a stack of timber to create a barrier. He remembered his training, the countless drills on staying calm under pressure, on reading an opponent's movements. Bernie was bigger, but Archie was faster, more precise. When Bernie swung again, Archie grabbed his wrist and twisted, using the man's own momentum to send him stumbling. The knife clattered across the concrete floor. Archie kicked it away and drove his shoulder into Bernie's gut, bringing him down hard. Behind them, Alexandra worked frantically to free her hands from the remaining rope. Archie held Bernie down, his knee on the man's back, his breath coming hard. "It's over," he said. And then, like a miracle, he heard sirens. Leo had been smart enough to give Mrs. Chen the notebook when she asked what was wrong. Mrs. Chen had called the police the moment phone lines were restored. They had tracked Archie's last known location through his neighbor's information and followed the tire tracks to the warehouse. 2 officers burst through the door, weapons drawn, and within minutes, Bernie Crow was in handcuffs, screaming about lawyers and rights while they dragged him away. Archie cut through the last of Alexandra's ropes and helped her stand. She collapsed against him, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. "Audrey," she whispered. "Is she safe?" Archie nodded, his own eyes burning. "She's safe. She's with my son. She's the reason I found you." Alexandra clung to him, her whole body shaking. And Archie held her steady, the way he had 7 years ago on a fell, promising her that everything would be okay. This time, he had kept that promise. The hospital was warm and bright after the cold darkness of the warehouse. Alexandra was treated for dehydration and minor injuries while Archie waited in the corridor, answering questions from police officers who seemed both impressed and concerned by his amateur investigation. They explained that Bernie Crow was being charged with kidnapping, assault, and money laundering. Alexandra's notes would be crucial evidence. She had documented everything: the false invoices, the cash payments, the pattern of illegal activity running through the lantern. Because of her courage to keep records and Archie's determination to find her, Bernie wouldn't be walking free again for a very long time. When the police finally let Archie go, he found Alexandra sitting up in her hospital bed, looking fragile but alive. A doctor hovered nearby, checking vitals and making notes. "You can see her for a few minutes," the doctor said. Archie stepped inside, and Alexandra reached out immediately, taking his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Archie squeezed her fingers gently. "You already did, 7 years ago, when you trusted me to help you. And yesterday, when your daughter did the same." They talked for a while, filling in pieces of each other's stories. Alexandra explained how she'd been running from her past for years, trying to build a stable life for Audrey, working whatever job she could find. The lantern had seemed safe at first, but Bernie Crow had turned it into something darker. When she noticed the discrepancies in the books, she knew she should leave, but money was tight and options were scarce. She had started keeping notes as insurance, planning to eventually report it. But Bernie had figured it out before she could act. He had dragged her from her home during the storm, hoping to scare her into silence. But he hadn't counted on a brave little girl and a man who refused to give up. Archie told her about his own journey, about leaving rescue work, about becoming a single father, about the guilt that had haunted him. "I thought I was done saving people," he admitted. "Thought I'd lost the right to, after Marcus died. But your daughter, she reminded me that sometimes the person who needs saving is the one standing right in front of you. And sometimes you don't get to choose when it's your turn to help." Alexandra smiled through her tears. "Maybe we saved each other," she said softly. Days passed. The village slowly dug itself out from the blizzard's aftermath. Power was restored. Roads were cleared. Life returned to something resembling normal. Archie brought Audrey to visit her mother every afternoon, watching as the little girl climbed carefully onto the hospital bed and curled up against Alexandra's side, talking about everything that had happened. Leo came too, bringing drawings he'd made and telling stories that made Audrey laugh. The 2 children bonded quickly, the way kids do when they recognize kindness in each other. Alexandra recovered faster than doctors expected, fueled by the need to be with her daughter. When she was finally released, she had nowhere to go. Her rented cottage was still a crime scene. And even after the police cleared it, she couldn't imagine going back to the place where she'd been dragged away. Archie offered his sofa without hesitation. "Just until you figure things out," he said. But both of them knew it was more than that. It was the beginning of something neither had expected to find. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed. Alexandra helped with cooking while Archie worked his shifts. Leo and Audrey did homework together at the kitchen table, their heads bent over books, whispering and giggling. In the evenings, they all ate dinner as a unit, sharing stories about their days. It felt natural in a way that surprised everyone. It felt like family. One morning, with snow melting outside and sun breaking through the clouds for the first time in weeks, Archie was driving Audrey and Leo to school when Audrey spoke from the back seat. "Mr. Archie," she said, her voice small but clear. "Mummy told me something about you." Archie glanced in the rearview mirror. "What did she tell you?" Audrey looked down at her hands, then back up with those wise, too old eyes. "She said you're the hero from the storm. Not just the snowstorm, the storm from a long time ago, the one who saved her on the fell. She said that's why I knew to trust you. Because heroes don't change." Archie's throat tightened. He pulled the car over gently and turned around to face both children. "I'm not a hero," he said honestly. "I just tried to do the right thing. Anyone would have done the same." But Leo shook his head, reaching out to pat his father's arm. "That's exactly what heroes say, Dad." Audrey nodded in agreement. And Archie realized that maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maybe being a hero wasn't about being perfect or never failing. Maybe it was simply about showing up when someone needed you, even when you were scared, even when you thought you weren't enough. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Archie and Alexandra sat at the small kitchen table with cups of tea growing cold between them. The flat was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional car passing outside. Alexandra looked at Archie for a long moment, her expression vulnerable and hopeful. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about everything that's happened. About how we found each other again after all these years, about how Audrey and Leo are already like siblings." She paused, gathering courage. "Archie, I know this is fast. I know we're still figuring things out, but I've spent 7 years remembering the man who saved my life, and now I've watched you save it again. You didn't hesitate. You walked into a storm for a stranger's child because it was the right thing to do." Archie waited, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Alexandra reached across the table and took his hand. "If you want," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If you're willing to try, maybe we could stop being two separate families trying to survive and start being one family learning to live. What do you think?" Archie looked down at their joined hands, at the way their fingers fit together like pieces of a puzzle finally complete. He thought about Leo laughing with Audrey, about the way Alexandra's smile made the flat feel less empty, about second chances and storms and the strange way life sometimes brought people together exactly when they needed each other most. "I think," Archie said, his voice rough with emotion, "that sounds like the best idea I've heard in years." Alexandra's face broke into a smile, tears glistening in her eyes. They sat together in the warm kitchen light, holding hands across the table. Two people who had found each other in a storm and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage. The next morning, snow had returned, but this time it was gentle, falling soft and light like a blessing. Archie and Alexandra stood in the doorway, watching Leo and Audrey play in the front garden, bundled in coats and mittens, building what they insisted was a castle, but looked more like a snow fort. The children's laughter rang clear through the cold air, bright and pure. Alexandra leaned her head against Archie's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Archie wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Thank you," he replied, "for trusting me both times." As the four of them walked down the street together later that day, heading to get hot chocolate at the cafe on the corner, Archie felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be, with exactly the people you were meant to be with. Audrey held his hand on one side, Leo on the other, with Alexandra walking beside them, her fingers intertwined with his. They looked like a family. They felt like a family. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but hopeful. Like the first day after a storm, when the sky clears and the world sparkles with fresh snow and new possibility. They would face it together, all four of them, no longer alone. And somewhere in the back of Archie's mind, he heard an echo of the promise he had made 7 years ago on a fell, and again in a blizzard to a scared little girl. "Everything will be okay."